National Summit. Can everybody see the screen and hear me okay? Okay, beautiful. So it's so wonderful to see everyone's faces. I'm sorry that we turned the settings on to show your cameras right away, but it is really beautiful to see your faces and get your energy on a Sunday morning. Firstly, just so much gratitude to all of you for joining us. I think we're getting pumped up for a day of connecting and learning and just energizing ourselves by meeting one another. But we wanted to kick off with a little bit of just reminiscing on last year, which felt very much like this, albeit a little bit more stressful because it was our first national summit. Um, so some of you were able to join us for that summit, but for those of you who weren't, welcome to the membership, welcome to SOAR, and welcome to our national summit. I want to give you a little bit of a rundown of what to expect for our first session. So we're currently in our welcome, overview, and keynote session. We're going to start off with a little bit of just, who's the team, who's SOAR, then go into some grounding and really kind of give us an understanding of why we're here. And then lastly, we will kick it over to our keynote, which is the moment that you've probably all been waiting for, and our team is so excited for as well. So without further ado, I will get into it. Oops. First things first, a little bit about SOAR. If you don't know, but I hope you all do as our dear members, that SOAR stands for Survivors, Organizations, and Allies Rising. We are a national collective of now 43 organizations and about 63 individual members. Honestly, with all of the social media posts for the summit, I think another 15 member applications rolled in within the past couple of weeks. So I'm not fully sure where that number is at right now, but we'll just say we're growing by the day. Yasmin is telling me it's gone up since I think last night. Yeah. Our mission is to grow both survivor and collective power to transform culture and systems that lead to violence. We'll talk a little bit about who's in the room today so you can really get a sense of what we mean by growing survivor and collective power. And on the right of this slide, you can see just like a snapshot of our work. I don't even think we had a lot of this work last year, but it's so amazing to be able to have these screenshots and get such a visual representation of things like our abortion care guide, our Woven Voices storytelling zine, a recap of our summit last year, and then Are There Light Remains and Together We Rise report. This is just a sampling of some of the work that we've done over the past 2 years. And finally, meet the SOAR team. We are constantly growing. This is our floating faces and heads. So just half of our bodies, but I guess that's the half we always see because we're a fully remote team based across California and mostly New York, Philly, and maybe some other states. I don't know. We're growing by the day. But I want to point out a couple of people. Your co-facilitators for today are me and Yasmin. Yasmin, if you want to say a quick hello.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yasmin. I use they, she pronouns. I'm based in Philly, and I'm SOAR's digital organizing manager. I'm excited to see you all today.
I think most of you all know Yasmin. And then on tech and in the chat, you'll see mostly Himadri and Sagar, but you'll also see Kushali and Nahian. And then you might hear from or see our other teammates, Adishri, Uma, and Hannah. So I have no doubt over the next 2 days, you'll get fully acquainted with and introduced to everyone. All right, and then before we kind of jump into the main content, I'm going to pass it to Himadri to lead us through some of the housekeeping for this summit.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Amrita. Hi, everyone. I'm Himadri, and I lead organizational membership at SOAR. You can see our community agreements on the screen, and I think we'll also be dropping them in the chat. I won't go over all of them. There's just a few points for today that I want to uplift from here. First, that we center learning, growth, and transformation. That means everyone in this space is at different points in their learning journeys, and we really want to be conscious of how we're taking space and making space. We uphold a culture of consent and respect boundaries. This includes not sharing confidential information outside of this space. We respect gender identity and expansiveness. This includes using inclusive language, not assuming people's pronouns. We definitely encourage y'all to put your pronouns in your Zoom screen name, like you can see the SOAR team has. And finally, we center and uplift those most impacted, including survivors, South Asian communities, LGBTQ+ folks, just to name a few. And if you have feedback on any of these agreements or any of our policies, you can always let us know. We created these with all of you, which we're very grateful for. And we can go to the next slide for some very quick housekeeping. Starting off, in case y'all haven't seen it already from our many, many emails, our Summit Handbook is your one-stop shop for everything you need during and after the summit. We're going to put it in the chat right now, and I'll quickly walk us through it, Amrita, if you want to take us there. Perfect. So what you're seeing on the screen is our Summit Handbook. At the top, it has all the basic information, including the Zoom link for all of our sessions. Just to note there, we only have one Zoom link for all of the sessions on both days, so that's all you have to click on to join any session. If you scroll down, you can see the table of contents. Perfect. You can click on any bullet point and it'll take you to that section. For example, Amrita, if you want to click on the day 1 summit agenda and sessions. Perfect. It'll take you to our agenda for the day where we have timings, session descriptions, and bios linked for all of our amazing speakers. We'll go through the agenda more thoroughly in a second, but if you keep going down, you can see we've also made special resource goodie bags for each session, which is very, very exciting. This includes some fun resources and announcements from SOAR. And the handbook also has live notes that we're taking for each session. Amrita, if you want to show those really quickly. See, there's a lot of resources that are resource goodie bags, but this is where we're taking live notes for each session. Amazing. Okay, I think that's everything for the handbook. Amrita can go back to the slide. Thank you so much. Perfect. In the coming weeks, we're going to send out the finalized session notes, slides from SOAR and our guest speakers, and the session recordings. We're going to add them all to the handbook and send them out to y'all. You can see on this slide, we've already made some accessibility accommodations for today and tomorrow, including frequently scheduled breaks throughout the day and in sessions. But you can also step away whenever you need to. You can have your cameras on or off. Feel free to be eating on camera, wear sweatpants, fold your laundry. You know, today especially is a very chill Sunday vibe. But we'd also love to know that you're there and engaging, whether it's by keeping your cameras on, you can share in the chat, use Zoom reactions. I think all of those things just really help us out in a virtual space. And on that note, we just wanted to give y'all a heads up that we will be taking a group photo at the end of today's session, and you can choose to keep your camera on or off for that. Finally, for accessibility, we also have live captioning, which I think we just shared how to enable in the chat. We're also using large font sizes, and we ask for anyone speaking, including speakers and attendees, please speak slowly and intentionally. And if anything else comes up for you, if you have any tech issues or any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat or just let the SOAR team know by DMing us. Like Amrita mentioned, we all have orange hearts in our names and we all have these bright orange Zoom backgrounds. So it's not hard to see where we are. And then if you go to the next slide, on a last fun note, when y'all registered for the summit, we asked you to share your favorite hype songs, and we compiled them all into one Spotify playlist. And it is so fun, such a diverse range of songs. Y'all have really great music taste, so definitely encourage y'all to listen along. I think we're just put it in the chat. Hey, thank you so much for bearing with me for those quick housekeeping things. I'm going to pass it back to Yasmin to take us through a quick grounding.
So thank you for walking us through so much, Madhuri, and for the reminder to speak slowly. Before we get into our agenda, I just want to root us in why we're here today. So throughout the summit, we're actually going to convene over 170 people, which is a wild number. They represent 25 states and over 40 organizations, and we're continuing to grow. And something else to keep in mind as we head into the summit is that over half of our registrants actually share that they identify as survivors, meaning that the work that we currently do, the work that we'll do in the summit, and the work that we'll do beyond the summit is not just for our communities, but it's also for us as survivors in this movement. Therefore, we're dedicating today's summit to those whom we've lost to violence, those who are healing from violence, and those who dream boldly of a future free of violence. This dedication feels especially important after a series of family and gender-based violence instances at the end of 2023 at the beginning of this year. In addition to the violence in the South Asian community alone, we're also experiencing an incredible amount of state violence that seeks to take away our bodily autonomy through restricting reproductive rights, trans rights, and more. And as we grieve and process domestic losses and this new wave of attacks on our agency, we're simultaneously witnessing multiple genocides around the world. Every day, we watch civilians being martyred as they fight for our shared vision of a violence-free world. Therefore, we're survivors not merely of isolated acts of violence, but also of deeply ingrained cultural norms and systemic failures. So today, we honor all lives lost to forms of power-based violence, including gender-based violence, state violence, and genocide. I want to zoom out for today's land acknowledgement in that vein to ground it in global land back movements that share our fight for systemic oppressions, such as the struggles for Sudanese, Congolese, and Palestinian liberation. Throughout today's sessions and breaks, we invite you and encourage you to reflect on the interconnectedness of the anti-violence movement and find moments to practice solidarity with the land back movements. So if you feel moved to take action, we encourage you to explore our Palestine Liberation Resource document, which we'll share in the chat. Something I think many of you are noticing and that I'm noticing is that in these global struggles, we've seen a newfound moment of unprecedented unity and mobilization, which has been really inspiring. Across identities, across borders, and across movements, we're called to disrupt the cycles of violence and challenge the narratives sustaining them. And it's clear that we all have a role to play in seeing our shared values through. So some of you might recognize this slide, this little graphic on it, especially if you were at last year's summit. Our past keynote, Deepa Iyer, created this amazing social change ecosystem map to help individuals and collectives identify ways to show up in social change work, to highlight the values thread that connects these roles, and to build sustainable movement ecosystems of belonging and collaboration. And I personally think that SOAR's membership is a really great example of this ecosystem and how to practice it. We're a group of artists, advocates, organizers, researchers, students, providers, parents, survivors, and so much more, all building collective power to reimagine our paths to justice, to reimagine our relationships, and to reimagine, most importantly, our conditions. And after reimagining comes a collective responsibility to think about what concrete steps we can take today to make our vision a reality. So I know I just said a lot to you, and those are really big things and big tasks ahead of us. So I want to quickly ground us for a moment to curb any like existential spirals or dread that you may be feeling or that I may be feeling. So sometimes being like a little silly can help center me. So I want to share, on the next slide, I'll show you a picture from the Museum of Modern Art. That was my phone background for a very long time, especially in college when I was like the least grounded. I want us to give ourselves the time to just sit in the oof of it all. You're welcome to close your eyes, to drop your shoulders, to relax your jaw. Here's the painting. It speaks for itself. So take a few seconds to feel your body. Is your hair touching your neck? Are your legs crossed? Can you feel the weight of your shirt on your shoulders? Make any adjustments that you need and notice each part. And we're going to take a deep breath in. And in your exhale, I invite you all to do a little oof or sigh with me or a deep breath out. So deep breath in and out. I saw some oofs, so thank you for participating in that. Open your eyes when you're ready. And now I'll pass it to Amrita to talk about why we're here and what we'll do today.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. I'm almost like too grounded to go through the next, and I'm like, let's just sit in that. But I really appreciate that grounding. And now, as Yasmin said, I'll take us into sort of, we went through the why we're here, and now it's kind of like what we'll do together today, and hopefully over the next 2 days. So as I was mentioning, we came together last year for our first summit, Together We Rise. It felt really fitting to just the fact that SOAR was so young. We had come together really only a year before that. We were just in our space of rising up together and really kind of feeling out the connections between our organizations, between our organizing and our work and our visions. Obviously, we're still building those connections. And, you know, so many of you, this is your first time with us at our summit, but we've also been looking back at the past 2 years and thinking about all of the work that we've created to lay basically the landscape of the gender-based violence movement. From our Together We Rise report to the state of the field to Their Light Remains, we've really been able to understand a bit more deeply what does the connection or what do the connections between our work look like, and what might we need to focus on or prioritize moving forward. And so that brings us to our theme for this year's summit, Together We Reimagine. We've already been ideating on next year's themes title, next year's summit title, but maybe we'll save that till the end. But all of this grounding and work that we've done so far feels like it really paves the way for us to reimagine. And I wanted to name two specific historical moments that bring us to this. The first is that next year actually marks the 40th anniversary of the founding of Manavi, which is one of the first South Asian gender-based violence organizations. And so the way we're kind of looking at this year is like, as we get to that anniversary of the first organization, what are all of the things we want to think about reimagining for the next 40 years after that? We also always talk about SOAR's work as new and young, but the fact that it builds on so many years. And there's actually so much history to uncover that could guide us in that reimagining and that visioning. And so Sagar's dropping a link to our entire movement history that we've compiled so far. But I want to name that also in history, so much is often forgotten and overlooked, especially of voices that weren't formalized in nonprofit organizations or maybe weren't in academic spaces or literature. And so part of our historical digging is also to see what's been forgotten along that road and what can we lift up. And secondly, this year actually marks the 30-year anniversary of the enactment of the Violence Against Women Act. This was a pretty crucial piece of legislation that sort of changed the trajectory of the gender-based violence movement. The content on this slide is adapted by a presentation from one of SOAR's co-founders and board members, Veda Kamra. Many of you know Veda, and I think they're on the chat today or on the summit Zoom today. But I wanted to point out two things. But the VAWA is actually part of the crime bill, which means that so much of the funding that has been generated as a part of it and has been crucial to many of our member organizations growing has also directly been funding carceral systems, police, and law enforcement. And what I thought was really fascinating in Veda's presentation was this quote: "Some of the initial community-based responses to battering were abandoned as the apparent need for a criminal response began to eclipse other perspectives." And in a way, when we look at even the South Asian movement's history, we see that trajectory. And so part of what I think and what I was sort of alluding to with reimagining is like, where can we go back to some of those roots? Where do our individual members and our work around organizing represent kind of where things started? So I know that was such a high level for such a deep history. We aim to create more spaces to actually learn and dig into some of that. But for today, I just wanted to give you a high level of those two pieces. This is kind of funny because this is actually a quote that we had in last year's summit slides, but we decided to put it in once again because it actually feels like it fits for our theme this year with one tweak. Last year, we said, today we invite you to reimagine with us. And today we changed this to, today we invite you to begin reimagining with us. This is such a long process and such a deep process, and it requires so much of what we're starting today. Everything from political education to skill building to community building and capacity building. And so much of SOAR's work, but especially today, feels like the start of this. I also just love this quote: "Nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our heads." And so we'll actually end today with an art making session that helps us create some of those images and put into the world our visual manifestation of what we hope to see. More specifically, intentions and objectives for the day are really to connect, to learn, and to vision. I kind of already spoke to that, so I won't dive into these more, but I hope that feels resonant for all of you. Feel free to set an intention for yourself. I think that's always a beautiful way to kick off the day. And I think in our art making space tonight, we'll also have a way to share some of those intentions. Lastly, for our individual members in today's space, I also wanted to name that you probably know this by now, but we have 3 organizing pods at SOAR so that you can actually tap into specific campaigns, emergent needs in the movement, or initiatives. So one thing to keep in mind in your intentions for this space can also be to think about, like, where do you want to plug in? Both what are the roles, like from the social change ecosystem map that Yasmin showed, that you want to inhabit, but also where do you want to plug into the movement? So throughout the day, you'll hear us talk about different ways to plug in, but I think if it's not in the chat, maybe we can drop the sign up sheet. But I know specifically we'll be talking and focusing on the reproductive justice pod today, and then a little bit more on the Their Light Remains work tomorrow. And with that, I'm just going to briefly walk us through our agenda. I know I'm a little bit over time. At a high level, this day is really focused on storytelling, organizing, and advocacy. After the keynote, we have a workshop on storytelling, a community building session, another workshop on reproductive justice organizing with 2 of our individual members. And then, as I mentioned, we end with art making. These agendas really reflect the intentions that we said. I won't go through day 2, but I did want to take a moment to just shout out our Hype Squad. We'll properly shout you out at the end of the day, but this agenda was really informed by all of you and then shaped by our Hype Squad members. So we're so grateful for your input. And I think that takes us into the last thing before our keynote, which is something that we're very, very excited to share with all of you. Today, SOAR is actually sharing or kicking off 2 new tools to add into your toolkit of reimagining. So we've been thinking about, okay, we're talking about reimagining so much, but how actually do we do that? And we realized that so much of what we're offering today is actually the tools to do that work. So 2 things that we wanted to call or share are our Transformative Justice Workbook and SOAR's movement commitments. The Transformative Justice Workbook is a 4-part workbook. It really brings the transformative justice practice, like the definition, the theory, practical ways to apply it to your work, to learn about it, to vision with it. And the reason we think this is so important is because transformative justice recognizes that we must transform the conditions which help create violence or make them possible. And so when we're thinking about reimagining, we're thinking about how do we want to transform those conditions? And that's where the movement commitments come in. These commitments represent the vision of that future state or of those conditions that we seek to see. So we see these 2 things as deeply interconnected tools for reimagining. And I'm almost done talking. I just have 2 more slides and then I get to pass it on to Yasmin. The first is just an exciting announcement that the Transformative Justice Workbook is launching officially after more than a year, I think, in development. On March 27th, I'll let, I think Sagar might already have dropped the information in the chat, but you can access it in the handbook or the slides later. This is a little preview. It has been a huge labor of love by our Transformative Justice Learning Fellow, Uma, and then the design has been so beautifully done by Anurima Kumar. And lastly, before I pass it on to Yasmin, I wanted to just give a little bit of an insight into SOAR's process for creating our movement commitments. I'm like a process junkie. I feel like I just love to share how we got to where we did, because it helps you see that we're just learning and evolving and growing, and we want to be transparent with our process. And this was also a labor of love by our team. So at a high level, SOAR, I think in the summer of last year, kicked off learning circles within our team. We started to map out what are the issues we care about, what are the issues that intersect with our movement. From there, we actually brought that to our individual members. Many of you were part of our town halls where we mapped out things like systems of oppression and power flowers. After that, we sort of took in everything that you all said, and we went to town doing research and analysis, working in pairs on our team. This is some snapshots. I think we maybe got to a 40-page document at some point with all of our notes. And then we kind of zoomed out, summarized all of that, and came up with maybe 10 to 12 top-line statements. Those are our movement commitments. Someone is probably dropping them in the chat. And the one thing I want to point out is these are always growing and evolving, but we have linked both the sources that we used and additional learning, because we really want to encourage go beyond our top line statement and have your own process of learning. And we hope to create more spaces for that. I'll pass it to Yasmin to actually give us a preview of our commitments and then kind of share what the next steps are.
Awesome. Thank you for going over that. And it's honestly nice to have a process person on the team because I'm not. Sometimes I just like jump to where we're at. And then when Amrita takes us back to the process, I'm like, oh yeah, we did all of that hard work, which is always an awesome moment to reflect on. So I would love to have some volunteers read aloud the next few slides. Is anyone willing to read this first slide for the survivor justice commitment? You can raise your little Zoom hand, or you can put in the chat that you want to read it. Yeah, Nishka, thank you.
Yes, we are committed to survivor justice. We aspire to a future of joy, healing, safety, and liberation for South Asian survivors. We believe in dismantling the systems of oppression and cultures of power that enable violence and prevent healing, especially for marginalized survivors. And we are resolutely committed to building new possibilities that amplify survivor voices, provide abundant resources and pathways to healing, and strive towards our collective liberation. Our commitment to liberation and justice is grounded in intersectionality and deeply committed to our commitments to.
Awesome. Sorry to make you end on a ... So it's an awkward ending, but the reason why it's there is because it's connected to all the other types of commitments and like forms of justice and things that we were like anti-imperialism. Everything that we see right now is like a connection of a movement framework that we want to make sure that we all like look at the intersections of it. So that's why survivor justice is like our main one, and then it connects to the following ones that we read. So thank you so much for looking at it and reading it to us. Does anyone want to read the next one? It's on reproductive justice. And I know a lot of you are repro justice pros in this room. So yeah, Laura, do you want to read it?
Yes. Through the reproductive justice framework, we uphold bodily autonomy as a human right and recognize reproductive oppression as a form of both state-sponsored and interpersonal gender-based violence. We are committed to advocating for reproductive agency, shifting culture, and resourcing our community. We hope to foster a world free from reproductive abuse where survivors can heal and find joy through self-determination.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we have time to read maybe like one or two more. Does anyone want to read the next one? It's on transformative justice and abolition.
Sure.
Go ahead. Thank you, Shakti.
Solutions for survivors primarily rely on criminal and carceral interventions, frequently leading to more harm and continued cycles of violence. We strive to abolish these systems and build solutions and practices grounded in transformative justice to support healing and accountability for those who experience and cause harm while rejecting the abuser victim binary. Our vision is one where these practices prevent and end generational, gender, and power-based violence.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. We'd like one more on LGBTQ liberation. So Rukia, I know your hand is raised. Do you want to read this next one?
Did you call me Yasmin?
Yes, I'm so sorry. Did I butcher your name? That's my bad.
No. Okay, no, I'll go ahead. South Asian LGBTQ plus survivors encounter compounded intersectional oppressions, from increased rates of violence to rising anti-trans legislation to exclusion within and outside of queer communities and discrimination when seeking help. Informed by queer liberation theory, our vision is a world free from homophobia, transphobia, and violence, where every individual can celebrate their own sexuality and gender expression without fear. We are committed to centering the voices of LGBTQ plus survivors, increasing knowledge and resources to support them, and challenging the cultural stigmas that perpetuate harm.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our readers. It's really helpful to hear it out loud and know that we're like actually committing to these things. So I think I'm going to skip the next couple of slides that have other ones, but this is all to say that this was just a sampling of our commitments. You can find our full commitments on our mission, vision, values, and commitments document that will be in the chat. But this is really an ongoing process as our team continues to have these conversations to learn more about ideologies and theories of change. So we're not going to stop at this. We're going to keep having our learning circles, keep bringing it back to our membership. So we really want to invite everyone to give your feedback throughout this process. And if you want to share your feedback or ask any questions, you're welcome to email us or fill out a feedback form that we have. It's linked in the chat, and you can also find that form on the document that we just shared. So as we're like processing these ideologies and these commitments, I would love for you all to reflect on maybe one commitment that you have been practicing in your movement work and one commitment that you want to lean more into. So I think the next slide has the questions that we'll have to answer in the chat, but in the chat, you can put down those two answers or just answer one of them. For example, for me, I'm practicing reproductive justice, but I would love to be more involved in and I'm curious about economic justice. So I'll give you all a moment to put your answers in the chat. And I think we have time for a couple folks to share out loud too. So if you want to share out loud, you're welcome to put that in the chat as well. Or I might just like warm call on some folks if you're okay to answer. As answers are trickling in, Justine, can I call on you to explain a little bit more about what you want to practice and what you want to lead into? That's okay. Back to you. Adishri, are you okay sharing your response?
Yeah, so I said I am practicing reproductive justice, and I would like to lean more into learn more about disability justice.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share out loud their answers or the reasoning behind their answers? Sylvia, I'm curious about your answer. Do you want to share more about storytelling?
Sure. Hi, thanks for inviting me. In my research studying rhetorical practice in the Bengali diaspora, I really try to locate and unearth rhetoric and stories that we hold close to our hearts, stories that we share in sacred community safe spaces, and stories that we are afraid of confronting and dismiss.
That's awesome, and I'm excited to learn more about your work. And also such a great way to you're not a plant, I'm just gonna specify that for everyone, but we do have a storytelling session that's coming up soon. And I think it's a really great way to practice like either articulating these commitments or showing how those values have been part of our experiences in our life and what we're doing in our organizations. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Does one more person want to share out loud what they wrote down for their commitments? Siley, can I call on you? Is that okay?
Sure. I wrote that I'm practicing gender justice and would like to practice more transformative justice, caste abolition, and liberation, like for all.
Awesome, thank you so much. And we do have a commitment on caste abolition, so I really do encourage everyone to look at the full doc. I think sometimes in our individual membership meetings, we don't have a lot of time for discussion, but we're hoping in our future ones we can go through the documents together of our commitments and then get some feedback on it and talk through it. So I really appreciate you all engaging with this activity and with the commitments page. We're excited to keep building on it, keep adding more reasoning to it and adding analysis to it. And I just want to start by saying that, again, this is just a process that we started with our team, but we want to extend it to our membership. So if you have any thoughts on this, or you want to come to our team with like, hey, I think this is missing, you should add this commitment on, or I've been thinking about this, such as like storytelling. I saw some others in the chat that we haven't listed yet. We're more than happy to add those onto the document and to have a conversation with our team. And so much of this work was actually inspired by our movement partners, such as Building Movement Projects, Sister Song, Survived and Punished, Lessons for Just Futures. You can find those resources in that document with the commitments as well. But I just want to say that we're so grateful to have them and to have Darakshan, a movement leader and someone who's inspired these very commitments, as our keynote speaker. So with that, I'll pass this to Amrita to introduce Darakshan.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. And thank you to everyone for sharing. I'm like so just inspired by reading what everyone is practicing and also what you are looking to practice. And I feel like there's so much just like connection we can even make there. So we'll make a note of who said what and think about where we can draw those connections. And now on to our highly anticipated keynote. I'm very, very honored to introduce Darakshan Raja, our keynote speaker for day one of SOAR Summit. Darakshan is the founding executive director of Muslims for Just Futures, through which she leads organizing efforts in Chicago, as well as national advocacy focusing on empowering working class communities and driving systemic change. Darakshan is passionate about building power, bringing organizing visions to life, and figuring out ways to build strong infrastructure for movement work. All of those to me feel so resonant to what we're doing here together. And truly, I can't understate how much we've been inspired by Darakshan's work, not just the literal things that Darakshan has created, but the way that she leads every space that she's in has been such an inspiration for me as a leader and for so many of our team members. You'll get a glimpse of that today if you haven't already. Darakshan has done everything from developing organizing institutes to narrative projects, civic engagement campaigns, and more focused on gender justice, mutual aid, and guaranteed income. Again, also things that feel so relevant and skills that we want to build together. I also just want to say on a personal note, Darakshan, I'm like such a fangirl, but and I've said that to you a million times, but you have inspired me. And I think particularly, I think back to the Transformative Justice Learning Circle that you joined. And I feel like everyone like rated that as the best session. And it was because you totally brought everything together for us in such a beautiful and relatable way. And I feel like it feels really full circle to know that next month we're releasing our Transformative Justice Workbook, seeds that you helped us plant. So without more introduction from me, I want to hand it over to you, Darakshan, and we're so glad to have you here.
Oh my God. It's my honor to be here. Truly, I am a fangirl of each and every one of you. I've always said this. I started in the anti-violence work, and I really believe the work you all do is literally some of the hardest work. You're out here truly life-giving world, building those alternative worlds, caring for our people, caring for survivors. And so my deepest honor to even be considered to be here, to speak to you all, to be in conversation, to learn from each and every one of you. And also just to share my own personal journey. And particularly for today's conversation, I wanted to hone in on the framework of power building and abolition as a tool, because that has been something that has grounded me a lot in the particular work that I have done. And of course, before I begin, I want to give a huge shout out to SOAR. It is so beautiful to see the space that you all are cultivating and building. I know that there has been decades and decades of work that other folks have done to be able to get to this point. So we honor all those who have come before us, all of our elders, as well as all the new youth who are in this space, building the kind of spaces that we need in order to truly build those alternative worlds and realities, because we know we're living in a death-making system, in a system that is killing and crushing so many of our communities. So again, my deepest gratitude. Before I begin, I also just want to be mindful that, whenever we're talking about state violence or gender-based violence, triggers and trauma can happen. So I invite you to really take care of yourself. If you need to go off camera, if you need to step away, really take care of yourself. Pay attention and notice what is coming up in your body and just care to it and tend to it. I also welcome any input, any feedback after this. I am here for you all if you need as a resource. I am personally invested in the South Asian ecosystem as someone who identifies as South Asian and Desi as Pakistani. This is really beautiful space that you all are cultivating. So I just wanted to put that out there before I share my screen and share my story and my journey. And really for today, you all are the experts in your lane of work. I am really here to offer some frameworks and questions that I know that Muslims for Just Futures personally I've been grappling with, but I also know our organization is grappling with, and also the broader ecosystem that I sit within, which is labeled sort of the BAMEMSA space, which is Black, Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, South Asian communities together. I think there's just big questions we're grappling with in this moment as we're dealing with fascist states, authoritarian states, genocide all out that is occurring. And we know that when those conditions exacerbate, gender-based violence absolutely exacerbates within our communities. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I won't be able to look at the chat, but please feel free to put any questions in there. And I will look to the SOAR team to keep me on time because I love this work, so I can totally get lost in it. So please definitely feel free to just, ground me, stop me wherever. And again, please feel free to put your comments, your thoughts in the chat if you would like to. I'll definitely get to it after I'm sort of done. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And then if someone can just come off mute and give me maybe a thumbs up if you can see it. I'm going to try to make this full screen so that y'all can see it. Let me know, folks, if you can see my screen.
Yep. You're all good.
Great. So for today's, again, conversation, I really wanted to go deeper into power building. And you can put it in the chat in terms of, how familiar you are with the framework of power building in terms of defining it or working on it. And again, it could be anything, but I'd love to get a sense in the chat of just how you all are grappling with this question of power building. So as you all do that, I want to ground a little bit about my own personal story and journey of where the work I have done really begins from. Obviously, I identify as working class from a Pakistani community. I grew up in New York City, really at the cusp around 9/11. I was about 12, 13 years old. So really grew up in an environment where both simultaneously dealt with some of the worst sort of post 9/11 policies that existed around immigration enforcement, registries. And also at the same time, it had created an escalation of gender-based violence in the community as well. So we had more instances of domestic violence and sexual violence, which were never reported out because that infrastructure really did not exist. And so it's really beautiful to know that, 23 years or 22 years post that moment, there's a much more robust infrastructure in place around responding to these issues, and that things have shifted where there is more awareness within the gender justice space of state violence and vice versa in spaces that are working on state violence, the intersection of state and gender-based violence. We're not there, but it has definitely moved. And again, credit to many of the people in this space and spaces like SOAR, Insight, Critical Resistance, a lot of Black feminists, Black abolitionist feminists who have actually done this work to really push us. So 4 particular spaces that really began my journey was one, I used to be a SART advocate at North Central Bronx Hospital, providing support to survivors of sexual assault in the ER room. And then second, I used to work at Kirby Forensic Psychiatric Facility, which used to be formerly right across Rikers Island. It was a space where folks who had mental health issues were criminalized out of the system. And then third, of course, growing up in the Bronx. And then fourth, had provided support to survivors who were navigating the integrated domestic violence court in Queens. These spaces began really the places where I learned from survivors directly how the system was not working. Every single time, despite my individual advocacy, trying to be the best advocate you could be, when there are structural gaps that you don't have the right type of resources, or survivors are being forced to report to law enforcement in order to get a place at a shelter, these are the kind of conditions and situations that really started pushing me to think about, wait a minute, we tend to sometimes place the blame on survivors and individuals and individual families and communities. Oh, that's where the problem is. But the reality here is all of this is a manifestation of state abandonment, and that everybody that is coming into these systems, and they come through at multiple points, is not being met with the kind of support that they actually deserve and need, but rather in some instances, it was actually worsening the responses. And this kind of space then led to the creation of a lot of the frameworks that I developed on later on around gendered Islamophobia and structural Islamophobia, because there's something about when you work with survivors, working class Black and Brown survivors, that because they're experiencing and navigating multiple systems, you get a much better sort of insight into how these systems are working together to create the conditions that they're creating. So I always say that 15, 16 years now, looking at where I'm at and what I've been able to co-create with so many other organizers and folks, this was really the ground where I really learned what the conditions are that many of our folks are experiencing. And again, that there is, real intentional state abandonment that is occurring. So moving on, I think for so many years, because I started out in direct services and then I moved into policy-driven research, then I moved into doing organizing work, is that I started grappling with this question of power. And, because I think when given the definitions of gender-based violence and domestic violence are often about, well, this is about power and control, I think that there's something around what is our relationship to power when you have been oppressed by people in power. And so I started really contending with this a lot of, okay, what is my relationship to power when state trauma and oppression are influencing this sort of treatment of power as something I don't want to deal with, or I have been the survivor of. But what does it look like for me to wield power, for our communities to wield power? And so these questions were things that I started really thinking about. What is my family and community's relationship to power? I come from a family that was impacted through partition, that has lived through state violence in the Pakistani government, to then the US government, which is also have experienced state violence. And that is power that's coercive, that's domineering, that is violent power. And so this frame that we start seeing that organizers often talk about of power with and power over. And I think that's a real defining moment for me of power over someone that is then coercive, that is domineering, that is abused, is the kind of power that is oppressive. But power with, meaning we build it together, we wield power together, we share power, is actually something that I wanted to lean in more into, and really is something that becomes a place of grounding of thinking about power building and organizing, and what does that look like for our communities who have lost power, but what is our power? So these are just some questions that, again, I was grappling with that I wanted to just lay out to share with you all. I invite you all to really cultivate a space of what is your relationship to power? How comfortable do you feel with it? What is your family, your organization's relationship to power? It could really unearth a lot of things and experiences, as well as where there might be discomfort or areas of learnings that can happen. In addition to these questions, before I sort of build out Muslims for Just Futures in the spaces I did, I was also grappling with some very real limitations of the gender justice organizations I was part of, or the direct services organizations I was part of. One was, for me, gender-based violence and gender justice work are not separate from civil rights work or ending state violence. But the organizational ecosystem of nonprofits was set up in a way where if you wanted to do gender justice work, you go to X organization, and they rarely had a frame around civil rights or state violence. And if you went to your community civil rights organizations and said, hey, we have this instance happening with a survivor who's not getting services, for example, from a direct services agency or from law enforcement, they'd be like, we don't deal with those issues. Those are not our wheelhouse issues. And so there was a real split that was happening. And I was like, but the Muslim survivors I am working with actually are dealing with issues across the board. It's not just one or the other. It's actually a multiple issues around that. Gender justice versus social justice, right? I think a lot of times, again, in the social services agencies that I was part of, it felt like there had been a bureaucratic way that now social services were being seen. It wasn't really a root analysis. There wasn't a social justice framework. It was very much just separated out of, we just provide this kind of train meal. You have trained social workers, you got a case manager, you got lawyers, you got law enforcement here. It really felt like this teasing apart, but not an ecosystem social justice framework. Third was around, what is the infrastructure and space for me and other Muslims to actually come and build power and actually address these issues? So the institutional infrastructure that is required. Many of the organizations I was part of were often white women-led leadership. Maybe they got one grant here or there and got a person of color who would then come in and take that program, but wouldn't have the power in that organization to really shape much. And so I really started thinking about, if I don't have the space to be able to do the work in the ways that I need to, then one, it produced a lot of workplace violence and abuse for me, a lot of just microaggressions, a lot of things where you start feeling really down, you start internalizing maybe just something wrong with you. And so it produced a lot of situations for me where I was like, you know what, I'm going to have to leave this, because the way I want to do this work the infrastructure and the institution is actually not set up for that. On the contrary, it's actually creating more harm. And I am complicit in that harm if I stay within this organization. So really thinking about what are the institutions, which is why I am so grateful that a place like SOAR exists, because we need the institutional infrastructure to be able to hold the kind of work, the visioning, the building, and its consistency over time, because power is built over time. It's not a one-time thing. It's supposed to be a crescendo effect. We win once, we build upon that, we win again, and it's the after the kind of the meta of that then creates the kind of systemic change that we actually need. In addition, there were pieces around just, the Violence Against Women Act. I remember working in spaces where they were like, we're receiving grants from VAWA, so we can't provide support to a survivor who's criminalized because our grant restrictions don't allow us that to happen, which again, if you understand the experiences of working class Black and brown women and folks who are survivors, we recognize how they're criminalized often by the system when they're trying to seek support, or sometimes the abusers will use the system against them to punish them, and they're not that great at discerning who's actually engaging in the abuse or not. And then this last piece that I want to say is about where is the frame around state gender-based violence. So obviously we know intimate partner violence exists at the relational level in families and communities and intimate relationships. But there's also state gendered violence as well that has been committed against, communities of color. Where is that work happening? Because it also plays a role in terms of how survivors are navigating and grappling. So these were the kind of questions and sort of limitations that were coming up for me. And I got quite frustrated about just, okay, how do I move forward? So this is where a lot of the body of work that then I sort of engage in comes out from. Before Muslims for Just Futures was created, I mean, there were so many other configurations that I was constantly building and collaborating and partnering. And it really goes back to 2013. So we're talking about 11 years of different configurations and work that was done to then lead to March of 2022, where then I co-build this organization called Muslims for Just Futures that explicitly in its mission and vision talks about building power, and talks about building power with a long-term gain. Because what we learned and what I learned over the years was that the rapid response work that I was holding and we were holding was tiring us out massively, that the conditions and situations that we were dealing with required a longer term arc. Many of the pieces of violence we are experiencing are things that have been decades and hundreds of years in the making. So we do need to simultaneously have the spaces for the care work, the rapid response work, the immediate survival needs that so many of our communities, and I know you all know this given the kind of work that you all do. But at the same time, we also need the visioning spaces to really come up with the where are we headed? What is the world that we really want to build with? And ensure that we invite community members, all the folks that we work with to actually engage in that visioning exercise. So it's not just something that's coming from, us in a corner somewhere, but rather invite folks as a way, visioning as a tool of power building on its own, because it allows people to be in a headspace to say, can we put the current situation just to the side for a minute? We know the survival needs, we know there's a lot going on, but really lean into an imagination of what would it feel like, what would it look like, what would that world really look like for you? And it can really offer a hopeful charting path for when, especially in times when we're grappling with so much violence that is occurring. So it's a little bit about just the timeline of the different pieces of work that happened that really led to Muslims for Just Futures being created. In addition to that, and I'll talk about this a little bit later about some of the 4 key elements of power building that I'll share with you all. But in addition to kind of the organizing work, the mobilization, the mutual aid work, the community defense work, community-based research work, is also developing our own frameworks, our own language. So one of the things that we did is we kind of did, especially because we work within the Muslim community, we felt it was important that we really name what is the infrastructure of violence that our communities are grappling with and build our own working definitions. Because a lot of times the frameworks, the definitions, the narratives don't often come from our people or our communities. They can sometimes be state created or from really privileged folks in academia, who kind of engaged in research, but from a further positionality away. And then those frames sort of become the dominant ways in which the state, our communities sort of are expected to see the state of violence in our communities, or the issues or the root causes. So we went ahead and then created these definitions around both structural Islamophobia as well as gendered Islamophobia. I won't go into the definitions here today, but if any of you are ever interested, happy to share our training curriculum, our sort of work that we have done. This is literally years and years of work based upon directly also community input that has shaped these frameworks. So in terms of, I want to offer a definition of power building. This is one definition. There are multitudes of definitions out there around power building. I will say that the organizing field is, we are contending and trying to figure out how to define this, because now everybody is using the term power building. Years ago, power building was very specific to groups that did base building work and membership work, so that making sure that our communities are at the center, that the organization's sort of campaigns and agendas were shaped directly by the base, by the membership itself. Now this term is starting to be used more broadly and loosely, which is fine. I think it's good for us to adopt a frame of power building, but wanted to just offer this definition that we have come up with. We define power building as a strategy utilized by communities that are directly impacted to bring about change by reshaping the systems and transferring conditions, as well as really reshaping material conditions. So by material conditions, we are talking about economics, we're talking about housing, we're talking about literally the day-to-day, the bread and butter, the neighborhoods you live in. I think that's so important to ground us, that when we're talking about power building or visioning, we have to ground it within the material needs and the conditions of our people, especially those who have been the most divested in and the most marginalized in our communities. Because without that win, we will lose our communities and we will lose the kind of buy-in into this particular type of work. It is a sort of a parallel in a way, and a tool for communities, especially those of us who don't have the kind of state power, the asymmetrical state power of state institutions. So being able to wield the military, the law enforcement, the courts, the financial system, the laws. It is then our tool to say, when we're dealing with such an asymmetrical moment in time, where the state and those who control that have so many vast resources that we don't have the same, power building and people power, which is what it's the core about. Power building is about people power, that our power lies within our collective, that it is we and ourselves together jointly are more powerful than all of these systems put together. This is something I wanted to offer you all, and I want to shout out our great friends at Rising Majority. Again, another kind of a space like SOAR that is trying to bring together movements across the country. They kind of broke down power building into different types of power. And for me, I find this quite strategic, because the reality is we are an ecosystem of orgs that sort of need to specialize in our particular form of power we're building, because no one organization can do it all. No one organization can perfect it all. And so we need to think about an ecosystem approach of, like, if MJF is really centering organizing power, which means we need to do base building, membership development, leadership institutes, that's us. But if there's another organization that's like, we really want to build deeply narrative power, then they have to think about, okay, messaging, comms, storytelling, what are the kind of archives? Like Sada has a beautiful archive that's narrative power building, right? So the ways in which they kind of broke down some of these powers is organizing power, material power. Material power, to me, again, guaranteed income, just transition, solidarity economies. It's like, we know that we are living in a system that is not just racist, but it's also an economic system that is depriving so many of the resources of our communities, of land, of labor, and that is creating the unjust conditions as well. So how do we transition from that kind of an ecosystem to something separate? And so the framework of solidarity economies, of just transition, has offered us actually something there. And you can check out Muslims for Just Futures page. Actually, we recently did a beautiful training with Beloved Communities Incubator as part of our guaranteed income program on what are solidarity economies. And so it can break it down a little bit more of what it looks like to move away from a capitalist infrastructure to a shared economics infrastructure, where you have land trusts, you have co-ops, you're co-sharing sort of ownership and leadership, as well as the economic benefits that happen as a result of it. And then, the other piece wanted to add in here, of course, if you identify, we're a Muslim organization, we very much ground and root ourselves in also an Islamic lens of social justice is that spiritual and religious power can also be something we can use for good. I really think about the frames of liberation theology, of what does it look like to have religion be used in the spirit of justice, not in the spirit of oppression, because we know we're also dealing with unfortunately, the exploitation of religion for state power and state abuse. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about for those of us who want to ground ourselves in the spirituality and the religious ethics, that is about collective liberation and about justice. And then the other pieces are, of course, legislative, electoral power, ideological power. But wanted to offer you all these different kind of breakdowns, because again, as more and more organizations I see adopting the framework of power building, I want us to get more disciplined and more focused and deepen and be honest with what is the power we can really build. Because again, no organization can do all 6 of these at the same time well. We just don't have that infrastructure. But what we could do is, which is why a group like SOAR is so important, is when these networks develop, then really the point of impact is to figure out how our different organizations are moving in relationship to each other, to then say the collective impact of our organizations is actually creating the kind of shift and transformative change that we need. And again, we know that the kind of communities we're working with, the needs that our people have because of just how much has been divested, is going to require more than one organization. So building deeper relationships with one another and getting really honed in upon, this is what we do, this is our lane, this is what we do well. And I know that I need you because you're doing a complementary work in that, and that our collective together is what's going to build a kind of impact. It also challenges the nonprofit siloing that happens. I wanted to just offer this to you all as a mapping tool that MJF has developed based on the breakdown of the power building piece in the last slide that I did. We did a bit of a mapping of how white Christian nationalists have been building power, right? And I think what's helpful to do this is that when we're thinking about the forces we're up against, the kind of forces that are harming our communities, it allows us to map the institutional power and the different tools that they have. And so we did this as a way to say, because we were kind of grappling with the rise of the white Christian nationalists and the ways in which they were really, unfortunately, co-opting parts of the Muslim community around the trans bans, and we're building power in our community through that. And so we were like, we need to do a mapping of how their sort of tools are being used against our community. So again, I invite you to use this. I'm happy to share with you all if you are, do one on Hindutva if you want, do one on anti-Black racism, on caste in our communities, but it allows us to understand the different ways that institutions are actually operating. And then to take it to the next step, I would say for the communities you're working with, map out how these institutions are operating in their lives. And so where do you need to be able to create a response? And again, I invite us to always move away from my individual org needs to do everything, or rather I invite you all to think about how our collective of orgs can actually help support. This is something I'm happy to again share with you all, but I think in the last 15 years or so of doing this work, to me, there's really 4 core pieces to the process for building power that I think are really integral and important. This is not necessarily a linear process. It's sort of an iterative process. But to me, these 4 core pieces for any organization or any configuration, collective, volunteer, whatever you want to build, are central to be able to achieve the kind of outcomes that we want. First is the analysis, really trying to get clear around what are the issues we're dealing with and what is the political terrain. Because a good mapping of that political terrain allows you to figure out what is the actual interventions that are necessary for us to be able to win. Second is a vision. They're great organizations. They might have great strategy, great infrastructure, great analysis, but if you don't know where you're headed, it's going to be really hard to stay the course, because we need that North Star. We need that beautiful world. We need those beautiful visions. We need that world where everybody has the resources that they need, and we have rest and we have care, and we can do way more than what we're doing right now. And so having a vision and inviting people to do that visioning is very, very important. The third is strategy. And strategy is where, again, you can use, what is your lane? Are you going to do narrative? Are you going to do advocacy? Are you doing legislative work? And, thinking about always, does the campaign or the program you are working in right now, what is the 5-10-year arc of this? Is this going to build and develop something later down the line? I always say in good organizing, there's no such thing as losses, because even if we lost one thing, if we built the people power, we built the networks, we built the relationships, we learned what worked, what didn't, you come back and you build that up and you'll win in the next 5-10 years, whatever that looks like. Again, long arc. And then last is, this is something that I think our ecosystem really grapples with, but the right is really good at, is infrastructure. And the point of infrastructure is, based upon your strategy and your vision and your analysis, what is the container that you need to build in order for that work to move forward? And this is why I say 501c3s, collectives, that in itself is not the liberation point way. These are just containers to help you to get from point A to point B. There will be a time you may need to shift that container based upon the political moment, as well as what you need to shift it. So really thinking about these 4 pieces together can really offer you ways to build strong power building campaigns, but also give you the infrastructure, the analysis, the vision, and the strategy. And then as I sort of close out for today, I thought of 10 key questions that I know that MJF has been grappling with and I've been grappling with, given the political terrain of the moment and the fact that there's been so much beautiful work built up. Again, I think SOAR is that example. I do think the South Asian ecosystem has been developed massively from the last 25, 30 years. And so a lot of love and kudos to many people in this space, as well as those who are not here. But I think we're also at a really critical juncture and point, given the amount of just violence that is happening in the moment. So I wanted to go back to some of the sort of key questions, right? I think one is I'm not sure if we have been able to bridge the gap between social services and social justice. I think there's still some work that needs to be done there between how do we bring these worlds together, because I've been in spaces where it seems like social services is separate and social justice is different. We can't be having that. We need to figure out where the integration of the two needs to happen. 2, what have we learned from 30 years of the Violence Against Women Act? So I think especially at this moment when we're seeing the framework of hate violence being co-opted further to expand national security and surveillance, I think there's some lessons from VAWA of the past 30 years in the gender justice space can offer to our broader communities about what happens when it's under a bigger 1994 crime bill that really expands mass incarceration in the country. 3rd, what is our infrastructure and space to build power? I really want to go back to this all the time, because without the infrastructure and containers, it's very hard to build the kind of strategic work that we need and get the impact that we need. And then 4th, it's what is the role of power building and abolition as a tool for analysis, strategy, and developing political alignment space for South Asian orgs? So I think this is a broader question for, I think sometimes abolition or something like power building has been seen as not the strategy to invest in, but rather other strategies like social services or advocacy or legislative work is, I think, where people have been. And then, of course, I think there's bigger questions about just like, what does it mean to be South Asian in the current moment? And what is it? Is it a political identity? Is it an ethnic? Is it a racial identity? What does that look like? I think we don't have clarity around that. What have we learned from our mistakes in the last, many years around caste, around Islamophobia, erasure of working class communities, anti-Blackness, model minority, all of these lessons from the past that have been rough and tough at times for folks to really live with, I think are important learning points and teaching points of where we can grow as an ecosystem and as a field. And then, of course, sort of last but not least, really thinking about where does the ecosystem position itself in relationship to movements for collective liberation, and what is our vision for 50 years? A lot of movements are right now talking about 50 years down. I'd love to see that kind of space out of SOAR or South Asian spaces to also vision out what does the next 50 years look for us. And then, of course, transnational solidarity, I think, is really, really critical, too, as we see the genocide, the ongoing genocide happening against Palestinians. I think given that the Indian state has its own regional dominance ambitions and what's happening in Kashmir against Muslims, I think we need to be mindful of how these sort of political moments are going to also create not just tensions for our communities here, but also for communities back in sort of the subcontinent itself. And then, of course, as we see the farmers' protests happening, right, we see the further alignment between the Hindu right, Zionists, and white supremacists, which will absolutely create an uptick in gender-based violence. How are we ready to actually respond to all of these pieces? And then I know I have like I'm over time, so I'll just spend 2 more minutes and then close it out. But I also think the other piece I want to bring back, since it's Muslims for Just Futures is such an org that's been doing work around abolition of the war on terror, is that we're just seeing a deepening of the war on terror infrastructure and the national security state. That is not just happening in the US, but also there are war on terrors being fought by the Indian government, by the Pakistani government. How are these different states collaborating together around the criminalization infrastructure back home, but also here? And I think the fact that we saw in Canada Sikh organizers being assassinated, I do think we have to pay some mind to these transnational ways that these systems of criminalization, national security and surveillance are operating together. So I'll pause there because I am over time, but I just wanted to leave you, I think, with this last thing, which is, as the state intensifies violence towards our communities, I think one of the things for us to really take very seriously is that how are we going to build the infrastructure to respond to survivors who cannot rely on the state? And as we see this further enmeshment as well between the hate, violence, and GBV work with national security and surveillance apparatus, what are the red lines and decisions for organizations to really take? Because we're going to see more and more state abandonment happening of our communities. So I'll pause there, y'all. Again, happy to offer any tools, any resources. MJF has a few on our website of kind of ways you can use this in your particular work. But again, I think we're in a moment where there are a lot of questions that we need to be grappling with, because this is a turning point that we are at. We can either move down this, terrible death-making machine of fascist authoritarian governments, but in that, what is our role as movements to be able to build those alternative worlds while also meeting the very real needs of our people? So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Darakshan. I don't really feel like I can follow that with even a thank you, but I hope you get some time to just scroll through the chat. There is an immense amount of love, so many reflections, so much appreciation still clearly coming in. I hope you get a moment to soak that in. But I want to say thank you on behalf of all of us for offering such resonant and inspiring and challenging questions to grapple with. I think everything from how we define power to then the different types of power to then a process, I feel like is exactly kind of the guidance that we were seeking for. And our team chat was even gushing like this was the perfect keynote to kick us off. So thank you so much. We can't wait to also just keep building with you, keep building with MJF and learning from you. With that, I'm going to pass it to Himadri so we can commemorate this moment with a photo.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Like I mentioned earlier, we'll take our group photo now. Feel free, if you want to be in the photo, you can turn your cameras on. If you don't want to be, you can turn your camera off. If you did not consent to your name or your photo or your picture being shared, we'll make sure that you aren't visible. But it's so nice to see all of your lovely smiling faces. So I'm going to take a few, so keep your smiles on for me. Thank you. Okay, 1, 2, 3, cheese. Okay, just a couple more. 1, 2, 3, cheese. Can someone actually spotlight direction again? I feel like I can't see direction in my screen, and I feel like we want to see direction. Thank you. Okay, amazing. One last one. Perfect. All right. 1, 2, 3, cheese. Yay, appreciate y'all so much. Thank you so much again, Darakshan. I'll pass it back to Amrita.
Darakshan, before we let you go, is there anything else you want to share with folks? I feel like there are a lot of folks who might want to get in touch with you. We will absolutely be sharing all of your information, but if you just wanted to say the best ways to reach out, maybe that would be nice.
Absolutely. I'm happy to drop my work email. Please definitely reach out. In addition to that, I also do offer coaching support for leaders as well. So I'll also drop that. If any of you are interested in sort of individual leadership support, I'm here for you all. So I'll put that in the chat for y'all, but also might just maybe give it to you, Amrita, and then if you want to send it out as a follow-up to folks. But again, deepest gratitude, y'all. Thank you for all the hard work that you're doing, and special shout out and love to the SOAR team for your incredible labor of love. So here for y'all, really proud, really honored, and just excited to see y'all continue to build power.
Thank you so much. Like Darakshan said, we are going to drop like her IG handle, email, website, all the things, along with any of the resources that were mentioned today. We'll also pass along the slides, and of course, you'll have the recording. Before we send you off to our 15-minute break, we just launched a poll so we can get a little bit of feedback on the session. I'm sure you all know why, but we would love to just keep improving the summit as we go on. And without further ado, we can go to our 15-minute break before our next workshop on storytelling for organizing and advocacy with NECA from Repower. So we'll see you at 30 minutes after whatever time zone you're in.